we're looking at Unit 3, so Lecture 4 will be on Unit 3, everything. So we're going to specifically look in this recording at Chapter 3 of Cook and Williams. So we're going to proceed with that, and it's all to do with procurement methods. So we're going to look at the different procurement methods. Now, many of you might have an idea of the different procurement methods, especially the distance learning students who are currently in the industry and working. So you might even be able to give me some insight with regard to some of the procurement methods. I'll give you try and give you some background of the procurement methods that I've been involved in and so on, working from public enterprises to private, all differing, and usually it's it depends really on the path of least resistance. So we've got a very interesting procurement method at this stage where we've got a client, but they've got an in-house service team that basically does building and everything. So we need to try and manage this building, or this process of refurbishing an old building by developing a bills of quantities for them, but they will be doing the reparation work and everything. So it is a bit different. So it's not actually going out on procurement as such, but there's still a large amount of project management that's going to take place. So that's just one of the methods that that you will be encountering in your career. And then we're going to focus in this module mostly the one that you're going to be involved in most of the time, the traditional method of procurement, where you've got your consultant on the one side and you've got your contractor and client on the other side, and where you prepare the tender documentation and you go out on tender. And there's other lighter versions of it, but we'll get into it. So we're just going to touch on most of them, but as mentioned, the traditional method of procurement is the one that we're going to look at. Okay, so whenever you preparing your project plan, also there's the golden triangle where you have cost, time and quality, and you have a balancing act between them, and then you can have the scope and the health and safety in between that usually dictates how things are done. So you've got your golden triangle, and during the project management of a project and the procurement particularly, this is the parameters that you try and keep into consideration. Although for the knowledge areas of project management, we've got 12 for the construction project management knowledge areas. Not saying that the others aren't important, but these are the easiest to remember, the golden triangle, and also the hard, all the items that actually influence your project. So you've got your cost that's available from the client, you've got the time, he wants it done within a specific time, and he wants it at a certain quality so that he can actually make money out of it. So, and obviously you need to know what the scope is. Are you building a 3-story house? Are you building a 1-story house? Is it a nuclear plant that you're building? Or all of those information actually has a big influence on how you do your planning. Okay, so this is quite an old triangle that was developed already in 1985. Everyone realized by that time these are very important parameters to look at. Okay, so the procurement criteria that we've got is, it really depends on the complexity of the project. Is it a very complex project? If it's a standard house building that you're building, you can either opt to just appoint a draftsman or architect and do the drawings and then supply the drawings to your contractor, who then will do all the measurements and the planning and the costing for it. Or if it's a bit more complex, where you need structural engineers and civil engineers on a more consultant type of basis, or advisement type of basis, you will obviously need to get in some specialists. And then you also consider the controllability of your variations. Is it a project where the client has quite a lot of funds and where he's not too strict on the budget? That will also depict on what type of considerations you will look at. And then the degree of the competition, how much competition is there. Usually if there's a lot of competition, your prices is usually lower, because if the price of the one team is not in line with what you had in mind, you can always go to another supplier and get another quote, which will push the rate down, or more competition will obviously have a big influence on how you approach your procurement methods. Then you have your client responsibility. Is it a public client? Is it a private developer? Is it a homeowner? What type of responsibility will it be? How knowledgeable is this person? If he's a developer with a lot of experience, obviously a lot of responsibility will also fall on him to get financing and so forth, etc., etc. Or if it's a public enterprise, there's a lot of procurement responsibility on their side as well, because they usually have their own procurement department, etc. Then you've got your risk on a project. So some projects may be a bit more risky than others. For instance, if you've got quite a slopey site, and where you have to get in a structural engineer to make sure that the foundations are sound. If you've got clay conditions, and also need a bit of a good design for your footings, obviously all of this will have a big influence on how your client considers procurement. Then you have your building or the parties involved. If you've got building, civil, it depends on what type of project it is. Again, if it's a public project, you will have the public also involved. If it's a high risk project, or a project that's in the public eye, obviously you will have journalists and some other parties also interested in this. So then you will have to stay to the book as usual. If you're working for the mines, you might have head office that's involved, or you might have only the local project managers that's involved, depending on what size of the project it is as well. If the project is of a certain size, if it's a smaller project, then usually they leave it to the offices where the project is taking place. If it's for instance a very large project with a large capital outflow, head office will be very interested in whether everything goes well, because they're investing a lot of money into this project. Then from this process of all of these considerations, the outcomes usually dictates the appropriate procurement strategy that's used. Are we going to use this traditional method of procurement? Are we going to use the JBCC contract? Are we going to use the GCC, etc., etc.? Then your client's principal advisor or lead consultant. Who is going to be your lead consultant? If you're working on a building project, you will use an architect usually as your principal agent, or a QS, or someone that's proficient in buildings. If you're using a if you're working on a civil project, then you will use an engineer usually as your principal agent or your engineer on the project. Then the appointment of other consultants is also dictated by all of these parameters above. your client's brief and assessing of the project feasibility. Is this project feasible or not? And then, does he have extra cash for it? Is it a very high risk project for him? Is he dependent on the income as quickly as possible, etc., etc.? Obtaining financing, if he needs to go if he has to go to the bank to get financing, will the bank accept the proposals, etc., etc.? Then you've got your procure and manager design and construction. What type of process will it be? Will it be a public advertisement? Will it be a short list of contractors that will be invited to the project briefing or whatever? Then your realistic periods of the project completion. Usually if it's private developers, you want it done as quickly as possible to get the income as quickly as possible. If it's a public project, then usually timelines is not that important, although you do have perimeters of your financial year end, your utilization of the building. If it's a library, maybe opening at the beginning of the year for scholars or so to access the facility or whatever. So the realistic timeline is dictated by the questions above. Then we look at a design process. Our design process is usually dictated or can be divided into 3 main areas. You will notice that these perimeters, the feasibility stage, the pre-construction stages, and your construction stages are basically a summary of the 6 stages that we use. We're also going to look at the rebar outline now shortly. Now, I'm not going to ask the rebar outline for you guys, so I really want you to have a look at the 6 stages rather than the rebar system, because the 6 stages is the one that we use in South Africa. But this is just for some background. It also gives you good reading work for to elaborate on what the 6 stages is and how that relates to our 6 stages that we use. Okay, so you've got your appraisal where you confirm the client's requirements. You've got the strategy and briefing, preparation of the client's brief. So this is the feasibility, they call it. So don't get confused by the feasibility and viability stage of the 6 stages. But this is just basically getting a scope from your client. What does he want? How does he want it? What type of team are you going to appoint? And then you've got your outline of the proposals, developing a full brief of what's needed. And then you've got your detailed proposals where you have some design done already. And then your final proposals of preparation of your final proposal, scheme plans, elevations, coordination of all components and elements, etc. And then you've got your production of information where you actually start doing your design and getting cost ready, getting your schedules done, etc. Then you prepare your tender documentation based on the design that has been done here at the top, and then you go out on tender. And once your tender has been awarded, so you appraise your tenders, and then the mobilization includes the awarding of your building contract and the contractor is appointed. And then you've got your construction stage where it's the administration and practical completion stage. And then you go after completion is your closeout stage, as we have it as stage 6. So very good reading to supplement your 6 stages and filling in those 6 stages and the outcomes thereof. Then we look at project management. Okay, so I've added those six stages here for you again. So this is just a slide that you've seen already. So we've got our inception and concept and feasibility. We've got our design and procurement stages following that. And then we've got our construction stage and then we've got our closeout stage. So remember, these 6 stages is the most important. So all of these other items that I've shown here is just for background to see how a pure project management process usually compares to our 6 stages. Okay, then we get to our procurement methods. So our procurement methods are divided into this table that's shown here. So we've got our design and build. Okay, so this information is from the UK. So this is according to monetary value. So you can see design and build comprises a big chunk of the cost in the UK. And the reason for that is usually the civil engineering or the big road and railway projects that they've got there. South Africa is very similar to this because our big projects are usually also design and build. If you think about Kulisi and the Eskom projects, they're also a design and build type of projects where the design and construction team actually does the whole design, and that's usually done for where it's a specialist type of installation that's going to be installed. Then we've got our traditional methods, which is where you have a design team on the one side, and then you've got your contractor on the other side. So you prepare your tender documentation, the information is developed up to a high standard already before it goes out on tender, and you can then either have a short list of contractors that can tender, or it's an open tender, or so it's just a method of where you have your documentation ready before you actually go out on tender. Then we've got our target projects, which is not that important, but that's usually where the documentation is a bit more limited, and where you have to you prepare your documentation up to a certain point, although there's still a lot of design that has to be done by the specialist contractor that has to be appointed, and you have a specific target of a cost that's affiliated with that. Then you've got your partnering, and the one that I spoke about on the first slide is basically falls within this category, where you've got a partner, or you've been working with this one contractor, or with this a developer, the design team, and everyone has been working together a little bit already, and you go into a partnership that, okay, we're in this as a team, we will partner together and we will get a certain amount after the project is done. Maybe the architect and the contractors, let's say, will be allocated a certain amount of profit after the project is done. Then you've got your management contracting, where basically you're appointed as a project manager, and then that project manager then appoints a contractor that does a design and install, although there's a certain amount of management from the client side, reaching certain targets or so. Very similar to this design and build type of projects. And then you have construction management, where the focus falls a little bit more towards the contractor side, where the contractor is actually appointed, and then he appoints a design team that does the design on behalf of him. Also very similar to the design and build type of contracts. So this is just the overview of the procurement methods. We will mainly focus on the design and build type of procurement methods and the traditional methods of procurement. Okay, so we're going to go through the 6 stages of the SACP CMP, where we have our inception, our concept and viability, our design development and documentation and procurement, and our construction stage, and then we've got our closeout. So as per the previous lecture where I've gone through all of that information, please make sure that you go through that as well. Okay, so the 6 stages. Here's a very nice summary of that. Is the local authority model, similar to the one that we've adopted in South Africa under the construction built environment, where you have your project initiation, project development and approval, and then you've got your design, production information, tender documentation. See here we've split our tender documentation, actually goes into stage 4, where the architect actually has a stage 4.1 and a stage 4.2, where 4.1 is the documentation that goes to the local authorities, and then 4.2 is the tender documentation. So within South Africa, our stage 3 basically falls, this last section of stage 3 from the UK actually falls in stage 4 already. Okay, then we've got our construction stage, which after the contractor has been appointed, and then we've got our completion and review date. So this is very important to know, and like I said, is I like to ask questions, putting you in a certain scenario, saying that we're in stage 1 or 2, you are the construction project manager or you are the construction manager, and you need to explain to your client the procurement process, for instance, so within this stage. So those are the type of questions that I'll ask. Okay, then we look at the building contract. The traditional procurement methods is where you have your client here at the top. He usually appoints an architect or principal agent, and then he appoints, or not appoints, he advises who the client should appoint. So you have your services engineer, structural engineer, your QSs, and so forth. And then the client, through the procurement process, the architect usually advises the client on which contractor to appoint. So the appointment is still between the client and the contractor. This is just usually the inflow of information that they're depicting here. You will see in the descriptions how it works, and then you've got your contractor with his different subcontractors, which has a contract with contractor and not with the client. Okay, and then you can see here's the actual contract between the client and a contractor, and then you might have subcontractors nominated by the client, or direct appointments that might have a arrangement with the client also. Then you've got your design and build, client-led design relationship. So you've got your client, you've got your project manager, and you've got your architect, consultant services, and then they do a limited amount of design, and your design build contractor then takes it further. So usually these consultants just try and put a scope together. So one project that we worked on is the vernacular there at Naval Hill in Bloemfontein, where the vernacular railway was designed. It never came off the ground, but a large portion of that was actually a design from the contractor. So what we as consultants basically did is we could design and do the documentation for the buildings, etc. And we basically indicated where the different stations would be, and where the railway would run, obviously with a specialist just advising us which route would be best. But then a large portion of that contract still actually went out to a design and install contractor that would do the last design, depending on what type of railway carriages can actually be imported or manufactured locally, what type of rails they would use, the power supply, etc., etc. Okay, so it really depends on how specialized this was. So, if, for instance, in that example, if it was only the vernacular that was required, then a larger portion of the contract would go to the design contractor. So, if there wasn't a lot of parking or buildings that had to be built, then it would actually go to the contractor, a larger portion of the contract. But in this instance, the client still had to appoint a consultant to at least get the contract going between whoever is appointed for that project. So you can see this is just the relationship. Okay. Okay, then I just added some information with regard to the Construction Industry Development Board. Your standard for uniform construction procurement. So your procurement documentation is usually dictated by the Construction Industry Development Board. So if you remember what I've mentioned earlier on in the previous lectures, is that a contractor, if it's a public project, he has to be registered with the CIDB to see what size of projects he can actually do. So if he's a GB contractor, he can do building work. If he's a 1 GB, he will not be able to do work for over 2 million rand, etc., etc. But the Construction Industry Board actually gives nice guidelines on how your procurement documentation should look. So the different procurement methods that you get from the CIDB is your negotiated procedure, where you have maybe 1 or 2 contractors that you want to go into procurement with, and then you start negotiating a rate or a project value between those people. That's usually also in a design and build, where it's a very specialized installation. And then you've got your competitive selection procedures, where you have a nominated procedure, where you nominate a certain amount of contractors and they can tender on the project. Only those contractors can tender. And then the one mostly used by government is open procedure, where it's an advert and any contractor that adheres to the requirements can actually tender on this project. Then you have your qualified procedure, where you only invite contractors that are qualified, so they screen pre-tender period. Then you've got your quotation procedure, where you usually don't have a design, so you have a certain procedure where you put out an advert that people can actually do a design and a quotation to actually install this building. Also, usually something like a competition is run, and the best design and cost efficient procurement is used. This procedure is done quite often in America, where they've got a bid system, basically. So the client would put out a need, and then it is then for the contractor to do the design and the costing for that. Then you've got a proposal using 2 envelope systems. So your envelope system is usually where you go out on tender, and then the contractors submit 2 tender documents. The one is only the perimeters, how they would go about to actually produce this project, and then the second one is actually their costing. So if they fall out in the first perimeters, then the closed documentation or envelope that they've submitted together with their tender is usually sent back to them, and they are not considered any further. Then you've got your proposal procedure using the 2-stage system, very similar to the above one. So the contractors just do their first proposal, and if they go through to the second round, then they can submit their costing for that proposal that they did. Then you've got your shopping procedure. Your shopping procedure is basically your similar to your negotiations, is where you look for the best fit contractor, and you might shortlist them to 3. I've worked on a project like that before, where the contractors are then you sit them around a table. These are the best contractors that you want to work with, and then you give them the documentation to price, and they can actually tender on that project. And then you've got your competitive negotiated procedures, where you have restricted competition and negotiations, and that is where you shortlist your contractors again, and you go into a bit of a negotiation. So you might get the tenders back, and then you would say, okay, look, this is more or less what we've got. Can't you is your price fixed or not? Are you willing to drop with your price or not? So a bit of a negotiation. Then you have open competitive negotiations, is where you have your purely a bid type of tender, where contractors can actually bid on a project. Okay, everyone, so that's a bit of a background of your procurement methods. So please go through chapter 3 for more info. So as I've said previously, please read through the chapters. So if you read through your chapters now and then study the study notes as a summary later on, you will not be overwhelmed, because that's a complaint that I get quite often, is that you're overwhelmed by the amount of work. So please read through your study material now already, and then afterwards start narrowing it down. So the hard work already starts now. So just try and keep up with the amount of work that we've done up to thus far. Okay, thank you everyone. Keep up.